So I'm trying to decide what I find weirder. Last year when I gave this talk, I did so from the chapel, and if you've ever had the chance to be in Tyndale's chapel, you know how big and beautiful and amazing it is, and you can imagine how intimidating that is for someone who's never spoken in a massive space like that to kind of get their head around. But this year I'm giving this talk staring down the lens of a camera. So that has its own weirdness to it. I like the human interaction, but unfortunately this is where we find ourselves now. Anyway, I just wanted to say hello. My name is Brent, and I am the learning specialist here at Tyndale. I oversee writing and tutoring services, and Dr. Noel asked me to come in today to talk to you about writing. Now, hopefully some of you will have had the chance to look over our orientation videos on writing, an introduction to academic writing or university writing. I can't remember the title. It'll be on the bottom down below in a minute. But anyway, Dr. Noel asked me to come in to kind of supplement that a little bit with some more information. So the orientation talk was a little bit about university expectations and about citation, which are super important things. Please go check out those videos. But now we're going to talk a little bit more about how to structure strong paper. So if you want to turn with me, I'm going to go to my screen, and then it'll just be a fade in for you, and then we'll dive right in. So, structuring stronger papers. Well, first of all, I just want to again introduce myself. My name is Brent, and I'm the learning specialist here at Tyndale. When we're on campus again, you will find my office in E306 and the writing and tutoring office right next door in E304. Can't wait to be able to have in-person appointments with all of you again. But until then, we do have an online option. So if you log on to classes.tyndale.ca, and then you click the appointments button there under the writing and tutoring services tab, click on that, and that's going to take you to WC Online, or online booking software. And from there, you'll be able to register with us. You'll have to follow a few instructions. And then once you're there, you'll be able to register, and you're going to see a calendar, be able to book with us. Please do so. We'd love to work with you. Just a side note, if you look also on classes.tyndale.ca, there's this seminars button under the Center for Academic Excellence. That's where you can go back and watch the other intro to writing videos that we've already made to learn more about citation. That's a really important one. If I can recommend any video, it's watch that one, because that's going to give you the information you need to know on plagiarism and citing all things properly. And you're going to want to make sure that you get that down as a university student right off of the front end. But that's the main stuff. Now let's actually dive in to the topics themselves. So what are we going to be covering today? Well, we're going to be looking at three things. First, we're going to look at structuring strong arguments. This is where we're going to talk about the ideas that go into your paper. Second, we're going to look at structuring strong paragraphs. Once you have those ideas, how do you put them into paragraph form to communicate them the most effective way possible? And then third, how do you structure strong quotations and paraphrases? There will be a little bit of overlap with that citation video, but this is going to go into a little more detail. So let's dive right in. So first of all, let's talk about structuring strong arguments. And I don't mean so much the right picture with the guy shouting as I do kind of more like the left, the puzzle pieces, because arguments are very much kind of like a puzzle. They are things that you have to piece together. The support from other people, your ideas, the quotes and paraphrases, the life experience you have. You're going to want to be piecing these together to create a strong and effective argument. So most papers are attempting to argue or prove something. You're going to be given a whole bunch of assignment task words throughout the course of your academic career. Explain, elaborate, compare and contrast, argue, defend, prove. All of these words have slightly different meanings, and we have a tip sheet online about assignment task words if you want to look it up. But you're going to want to figure out what it is you are trying to prove or explain or communicate in your papers. And it's important that you realize that most papers are arguing or proving something. There's an idea that they want to get across, which means that your argument needs to be consistently strong. If you have a weak link, piece of the Jenga tower, as it were, that's a weak point, it can be exploited. All it might take is a professor to ask you one question and your entire paper falls apart. So you want to make sure that your argument is strong on the front end. Your arguments, therefore, need to be thought out, they need to be supported, and they need to be clearly communicated. So let's break each of those down. Thought out. What that means is that your ideas need to be logical, and they need to logically build to a strong, reasonable, and interesting conclusion. You can't just make up facts and throw them on a page and talk about this and that and the other thing, and nobody has any idea of how one idea connects to the next. There needs to be a structure here. There needs to be a logical, thought out structure that shows how one idea leads to the second idea, leads to the third, and so on. Second, papers need to be supported. If all you do is write your own information on a piece of paper, that's sure, sometimes that's what professors want, but a lot of times they're going to be looking for research. They're going to be looking for other people's arguments, other people's quotations, other people's statistics, all of that kind of stuff to back up your research. And we'll talk a little bit about citing that properly in a moment. And of course, they need to be clearly communicated. You can have the best ideas in the world, but if your spelling and grammar and your sentence structure is totally off, it's going to be very hard for your reader to understand what you're saying. So you want to make sure that your ideas are not only logical, but they need to be backed up by what other people have said, and they need to be clearly communicated with effective spelling, grammar, sentence structure. Make sure you're not doing run-on sentences or half sentence fragments or all that kind of stuff. You want to make sure that you are doing clearly communicated arguments. So what is then a strong paper structure? Well, every paper is going to consist essentially of three things. First, it's going to consist of an introduction. This is usually going to be a paragraph, maybe 2 or 3 if you've got longer papers, but it's an introduction that grabs your reader's attention. This is where you're going to introduce the topic of your paper. What is the big idea that you are looking into? You might ask your reader a question about that thing. You might mention a problem that is going on with that topic. But you're trying to establish for your reader why this topic, why this paper you are writing is actually important. And this is where you're going to put your thesis. As you may have heard from our previous video, you always need to have a thesis statement in your writing. So that's going to be in your introduction, often towards the end, but not always. But just that main idea, that central unifying idea that is going to focus and organize your paper. After the introduction, you dive into the body of your paper. This is basically almost the rest of your paper. This is multiple paragraphs where you basically pick this organizational method, and then you use your paragraphs to argue an idea. So we'll talk about some of those organizational methods in a moment, but each paragraph is building on an idea or contributing to ideas to help prove that thesis, that big idea that you want to get across in your paper. And then, of course, the last paragraph or two is going to be your conclusion. This is where you come back to the main idea again of your paper, and you're going to oftentimes rephrase the thesis. Please don't just regurgitate. And then you're going to give your reader maybe a bit of a summary. If you had 3 main points in your paper, you probably want to have 3 sentences or so, one each summarizing those main points. And then, of course, leave your reader with something to chew on, a question, an idea for future research, a reason that this paper on this tiny little aspect of a certain discipline applies to larger aspects of life. So every paper is going to need those 3 things: introduction, body, and conclusion. But then how do we actually break down that body of the paper? How do you choose what structure is best? Which organizational method, as I said in the last slide, which one makes the most sense? Well, there are different ones you can choose, but it comes down to what your paper is trying to accomplish. So if you are trying to do a comparison between 2 things, you want to look at the similarities and the differences, then maybe you want a compare and contrast formula. Look at how these ideas are the same, how these ideas are different. Look at one thing in full, then look at another thing in full, and draw similarities and differences. That's the kind of thing for that formula. Maybe this is very good in, say, a history paper. You might do a chronological structure. This is where you start at the beginning and then work your way through time till the end. You don't want to be telling, you don't want to write a history paper about a certain battle where you start with the end and then you move to the middle and then you go back to the end for a bit and then you go to the beginning. And it's just going to confuse your reader. So sometimes chronological order is the best bet. Other times you might want to do cause and effect. This can be very useful for things like philosophy or even some theology things. If you assume this, then how does that follow? Cause, effect. That's what you want to be aiming for. Or look at how this thing over here causes the next thing to happen, which causes the next thing to happen. Now, let your ideas build on one another. And other times we're going to be dealing with what we call climactic order. This is where you have 3 potentially related ideas, potentially distinct ideas, but you're kind of building to a climax, this big dramatic point that you want to make at the end. Alternatively, with this one, you can consider the serial position effect. So usually this is the part of the class where I ask the room, what is the third letter of the alphabet? And you say C. Perfect. Yes. And then I ask, what is the last letter of the alphabet? And you say Z. Perfect. And then I ask, well, what's the 16th letter of the alphabet? And then I just get blank stares because everyone's like, I don't know. And this is exactly what the serial position effect is. It states that as human beings, we have a tendency to remember the beginning and the end of lists really well, but we get fuzzy in the middle. You may even notice that when you're like reading a book or watching a movie. If somebody asks you to tell them about the beginning of a movie or the end of a movie, you will be like, oh yeah, that was really good. But when they ask for details, and I don't just mean like general stuff, but details about the middle of the movie, you're like, well, I mean, there was this battle and they did stuff, and oh yeah, and then there was this other thing, because it feels like it's kind of jumbled and out of order. But when it comes to the beginning and the end of movies, of books, of lists, we remember those beginning and end things really well. So if you're writing a paper, it can be super useful to start with a really strong idea, end with a really strong idea, and if you have some weaker points, not weak points, but weaker, not maybe as convincing arguments, they would be better to go in the middle. But again, you have to figure out what makes sense for your paper. Each one is going to be a little bit different. You're never really going to know until you've decided what your topic is, what you're arguing, what is the research that you're trying to delve into. So you'll have to decide for yourself what structure is best. Now, one other really important step that I find is group like things with like things, or as I like to call it, outlining. Not everybody likes to do this. They think outlines are a waste of time, but I could not disagree more. Outlines are a great way to get your ideas on a page in an organized way at the very beginning. So you're going to outline by looking for those big arguments we talked about. So if you have your thesis statement, dogs are the best. That is a terrible thesis. Please don't ever make a thesis like that, but stick with me. I needed something simple. Dogs are the best, right? So you might have three main arguments for why dogs are the best. They are the best because they allow you to get exercise. They are a very social animal, and they are protective. I don't know. We'll probably just focus on the first two. So you're going to be looking for the main arguments, the big divisions of your paper. So exercise is a big division. Oh no, what was the second thing I said? Social, being social with people is the second one, and then the third is protective. So you're going to look for those big things. Then as you do your research, you have this basic structure. You're now able to get those ideas and lump them together. So, okay, so exercise. Well, you have to take a dog for the walk every day. So therefore you're going to get out and exercise, and they're going to run around in the park a lot. So you're going to have to chase after them, and they run up and down the halls in your home, or your run around the room in your apartment building or whatever. So now all of a sudden, you've got three big ideas all lumped together under that bigger idea about how dogs are good for exercise. That is outlining. It is putting all like things together in a ordered, structured way so that you can prove your point. And then from there, once you've made that lovely outline, you can actually put that into word form. You can do it in pictures. I'm more of a word person myself, or a list person, so something like this. So again, our thesis statement, dogs are the best. Main topic 1, that dogs are good for exercise. Okay, great. So point A, they are good for exercise in the park. So you bring in the supporting evidence. You read a handbook that told you about how often dogs need exercise, which shows that you're going to be getting a lot of exercise. Then you give an example. Well, in my life, I had a dog when I was young, and I would always run after them in the park, and it was a great time, and I got really fit because of that. All right, well then part 2, they're also really active in the home, and so on. You can fill in very simply an outline that helps prove your point. However, you might not be a words person. Maybe this terrifies you. That's totally fine. You can also do a mind map. Mind maps are great because they're more picture. They might have some words, as you can see, but you've got kind of this image version. So maybe this is your first main point, your second main point, your third main point, and so on and so on. You can have little branching off. You can even, I didn't do it here. This isn't even mine. I got it from Wikipedia. But you could actually like draw connections between the two ideas.
And that way you're going to be able to, if you're more of a visual person, you're going to be able to very clearly make connections between ideas when you're actually doing the writing for yourself. Now, by all means, you can draw it by hand, or there's this software called Mindomo. We have a little bit of information about it. You can check in with me or Rachel Vonk, our accessibility person, and we can get you kind of set up with that as well. But yeah, outlining. Again, I can't stress enough. A lot of people think it's a bit of a waste of time. I think it's super useful because oftentimes if you just sit down to write and you start going at it, where you start and where you end are going to be two very different places. You're going to have a whole different argument at the end than you thought you might have, which means then you're going to have to go back and redo a lot of the beginning. Because again, our arguments need to be thought out. There needs to be a structure. You can't just kind of ramble and wander around and suddenly end up over here. You want there to be a logical connection, a consistent moving towards that point. So please take that time to organize your thoughts in advance with an outline. It is going to actually save you a lot of time in the long run. So that is structuring strong arguments. Let's now talk for a minute about structuring strong paragraphs, because we know that we want a thought out argument, but you want to be able to write your paragraphs in a clear and effective way. So paragraphs. A strong paragraph is going to develop an idea or an aspect of an idea. So I like to think of paragraphs as idea chunks. If you are talking about like one idea and you're giving a few examples about it, great. But the second you move on to a new idea, a bigger idea, again, this is not like the as we said before with the exercise, right? So you quote the handbook and then you give an example of your own experience with playing with dogs in the park. Those are both connected to the idea that you have to take the dog for a walk and get exercise, right? So that's the idea you're getting at, idea chunk. But if you have a new one, you move on. Anyway, each paragraph should have the following or test. So first, it should have a topic sentence. A topic sentence introduces the big idea of that paragraph. So it's kind of like a mini introduction for the paragraph. So in our previous example, we'll use the exercise one again. Since exercising is so important to a human's health, having a dog as a pet can be really helpful for getting personal exercise. Bam, great, topic sentence. Now we know exactly what that paragraph's going to be about. Then we give our examples, our evidence, our explanations, all for E. And these are ideas or sentences that support and prove and elaborate on that topic sentence. So this is where you say, as noted in the Dog Walker's Handbook 2020, comma, blah, 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 blah. And then you actually quote something. Then you give an example from your own life where you went, you played with your dog as a pet and it got you lots of exercise. Now all of a sudden you're giving examples, elaborations. You're providing more information on that big idea in the topic sentence. And then often, this one is optional. It is often good to include a sentence at the end of the paragraph that kind of reinforces the idea of that paragraph. Again, you're not just going to restate the topic sentence. You're going to want to kind of come back around to it and say, and based on that, we now know why dogs are good for exercise. These are also good if that like summary sentence can also kind of point forward a little bit to whatever the next paragraph is going to be about. But we'll talk about some of that in a moment. So that's what the sentences are, topic sentence, your examples, your summary, and it's super useful to have transition words. Transition words are basically linking words or signposts that point your reader in the right direction. This can be things like also, however, moreover, first, second, third, all of those kind of words. And they're words that you're going to pick up often in very good writing because it's going to be pointing the reader in the right direction. Again, we have a tip sheet on that on our website, a whole bunch of different transition words and when are good to use them. So feel free to check that out. I don't remember the URL, www.tyndale.ca/writing-tutoring/resources/tip-sheets or something like that. I'll have it again down below in a moment. But yeah, so having those transition words, and then you want to always test your paragraph. So have that topic sentence, have those examples, have the summary sentence, usually, and then the transition words. Have those signposts that point your reader to what's coming next. Another way of putting this is your examples shouldn't just exist in a vacuum. So when you introduce an example, you shouldn't just be like, the handbook states exercise is good, and that's all you say. No, you want to have this, you want to kind of build to it. So first, give the point, introduce your idea, give the information that you want the reader to know. Then provide the proof. Provide an example, a quotation, a personal experience, a hypothetical scenario, all those kind of things, and then analyze it. Provide additional insight as to why this proof backs up the point, or why that point is relevant to the larger argument. So don't just give me the point you're trying to make, prove it, and then analyze why that proof proves your point, or why that point is important for the larger discussion you're having with your thesis statement and all that kinds of stuff. So those transition words, let's look at this a little bit more. I'm going to read this paragraph to you. There's a lot. And then afterwards, I'm just going to ask you to pause for a second and try and pick out the transition words for yourself. So I also had trouble defining my audience. I briefly alluded to the fact that my audience was a typical American reader. However, I later decided to address my paper to an Asian American audience for two reasons. First, it would establish a greater ethos for myself as a Chinese American. Obviously, I didn't write this. Second, it would enable me to target the people the Wenho Lee case most directly affects, Asian Americans. As a result, in my final research argument, I was much more sensitive to the needs and concerns of my audience, and my audience trusted me more. So take a second, pause the video, see if you can pick out a few of the transition words, and then we'll come back. All right, so I'm going to reveal it now. So we've got here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5 different transition words or transition phrases. So also is really good because it kind of builds on, in the previous paragraph, there was probably some other trouble that they had. However is great because it kind of provides a contrast. So I mentioned this before. However, by contrast, I later decided to do this. First and second means that you're listing things, so there's a bit of an order there. And as a result is about consequence. So because of what was said before, this is the result. This is the consequence. So that, again, is a really good way to indicate to your reader, this is what's coming. This is how what I said before is important for what I'm saying now, all of that kind of stuff. Transitions are incredibly important. Try to get used to using them. Just don't feel you need to go overboard. It's not like every single sentence has to have a transition word, but having them regularly can help. Repetition is also a good thing. Now, I'm not going to make you read this long paragraph because we don't have the time for that, but I just want you to notice this. We've got here, what have we done to promote the art of thinking? Certainly, we make no time for thought. I need some time to myself, some time to think. We fear and distrust people who think too much. We believe that almost anything is more important than thinking. So notice that we're not actually repeating the exact same word each time. We see think, thinking, thought, all different forms of the same word. This is really good because it builds a connection in our minds between this idea. So every time you say think or thinking or thought in this paragraph, it's building on the idea that's already there. And notice again, it's not every single sentence. It's certainly not every single word. It is happening regularly, but not overly frequently. So in a paragraph this long, we see it 5 times. It's not in every sentence. There's a few that are missing it, but it gives that connection in your brain that all this paragraph is about thinking and how we need to not be too concerned about overthinking things. Now, so far we've only been talking about transitions and repetition within a paragraph. It can also be really good to do that between paragraphs. So anger can also be a measure of grief. Now, depending on the context, this could mean 2 things. It could mean that anger is, among other things, measures of grief. Or it could be that anger is also a measure of grief, whereas the previous paragraph, it could have been that anger is a poor reaction to stress, right? Like we can have, it depends on the context, but it shows you that we're building on a list of something that was in the previous paragraph or 2 or 3. And similarly, repetition. If you end and start a paragraph like this, in fact, human offspring remain dependent on their parents longer than the young of any other species. Children are dependent on their parents or other adults, blah, 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 blah. We've now made a connection. So in your mind, you're not even going to realize you're doing it, but in your mind, you are going to make a connection between what was talked about in the previous paragraph and what's now being talked about in this paragraph. It's a logical build, and it's just the same small little phrase. So try using those things. Repetition, transition to build those things. And don't be afraid to use both of them. You can actually do that between paragraphs. This careful combination of ingredients is little more than a scrumptious form of science. Yet, while some perceive baking as only a science, an experienced baker might defy that assumption. Right away, we get the previous paragraph we can probably assume was about how baking is a science, and yet this new paragraph might give the impression that baking is something else. Maybe it's an art form. We've repeated science to draw the connection in your mind, but then we have yet, again, a matter of contrast, and then while, it's showing that while this may be true over here, this is also true over there. So those are just some really important words and tips and writing styles that you can adopt in order to strengthen not only your individual paragraph, but the logical flow between paragraphs. And then finally, let's talk about structuring strong quotations and paraphrases. These are some of the examples that we were looking at earlier. One of the big things you're going to be falling back on. So we talk about quotations and paraphrases, again, a lot more in the citation video. Again, I cannot stress enough, if you have not watched that, please do so. It's extremely important that you understand how to quote properly, how to cite properly, and that video goes into things in more detail. You can also book appointments with us if you want to make sure that you get this right. But just in brief, again, what do you do when you want to include a quotation? Well, you have to make sure that you connect the quotation to your argument. So just like we said, everything needs to be a logical flow. You don't want to just randomly out of the blue drop a quotation in, but it needs to be connected. Introduce with your own words first. Then enclose the borrowed wording in quotation marks. Put it in the quotes, or if it's a longer quote, a block quote. Again, you can find out more about how to do that in the citation video that I talked about. Then explain how the quotation illustrates your ideas and adequately interpret it. So summarize the quote, analyze it. Tell me why the quote is relevant to your argument. Don't make the quote stand on its own, but back it up with your own thoughts that interpret why that quote is important for the bigger argument you are trying to say to support your thesis. So when do you want to quote? Well, it's really good to quote when there is a certain word or phrase that you need to capture exactly. Maybe there's only like 2 or 3 words that you really need to get across. By all means, just quote that. If you want to give extra authority or credibility to your argument, the reality is that if only you say something, I hate to say it, that's not all that believable. But if you say that Professor so-and-so said this, and famous author over here said that, all of a sudden you've got a lot more credibility to your argument. It shows that you're not just making things up on the fly, but that other people think the same thing as you. Suddenly your argument becomes more believable. Maybe there's something that the original author said that's just really memorable, and you want to make sure that you capture the spirit of that idea exactly. By all means, that's a great time to use a quote. And then sometimes it's because you want to analyze something in further detail. This could be a piece of literature. It could be something from your textbook. It could be a passage of scripture. But you oftentimes, if you want to analyze something in depth, it's good to quote the original and then break it down more about why you think it's important, why you think it's relevant, all that stuff. And on the flip side, if you disagree strongly with somebody, quote them first, allow them to speak for themselves, and then you can say why you disagree. Then you can say why you think their idea is nonsense, but allow them to first present their own argument. So how do you not quote? What should you avoid? Well, don't start or end a paragraph with a quotation. There are exceptions. Sometimes opening an introduction or closing a conclusion with a quote can be a really strong way to get your reader's attention. But for the most part, remember, your quotation should always be followed up with an analysis of why it's relevant, and it should always be introduced with your own words. So if you're doing so as examples in the body of your paper, please make sure that you are not starting or ending sentences or paragraphs with quotes. Don't just drop a quotation into your paper. If your sentence starts with a quotation mark and just says the Polis of Sparta was one of the great ancient military powers, you're doing it wrong. You want to always make sure that you, at the very least, start with so-and-so writes the Polis of Sparta was one of the great ancient military powers. You want to make sure that you are giving credit where credit is due, by all means, but more important, you just want to make sure that you're not just jumping in with a quote. Start with your own words first. And then please don't forget to include an in-text citation when you quote things. If it's a footnote, or if it's Chicago, you'll use footnotes. If it is MLA or APA, you're going to want to make sure that you're using in-text citations, brackets. And again, you can take a look at the previous video that we talked about, or our tip sheets on citation. They're going to become your best friend. Make sure you take a look at them so you can understand how to quote things properly. And then when do you paraphrase? Well, paraphrases are good when you want to take the author's idea, but not their exact wording. So maybe you're like, I don't need to give this exactly, I just want to get the idea across, then you can paraphrase. But again, you still need to cite things. So if you are taking somebody else's ideas and putting them into your own words, you must cite it. If you do not, it is considered plagiarism. Then we're going to have a chat and it's not going to be nearly as fun as today's is. So make sure that you are citing things properly. Give credit where credit is due. Now, why do you paraphrase? Because it actually shows your professor that you understand the material that you are referencing. If you always just quote things, it's going to be a lot of other people's words. But your professor wants to know that you understand, that you agree. So by paraphrasing, it shows not only that you understand the original material, but it shows that you can incorporate it into the argument that you're trying to make. So please use paraphrasing. It's super helpful. Professors want to see it. But just remember, it requires more than just finding a synonym. So a paraphrase should have a totally different sentence structure. It should not look the same. If you've just gone into a thesaurus and changed 2 words, that's not good enough. It needs to look different. So as an example, this is in that citation video, so I'm maybe spoiling it for you. If you see that first line there, students frequently overuse direct quotation in taking notes, and as a result, they overuse quotations in the final paper. Compare that to the one below. In research papers, students tend to quote excessively, failing to keep quoted material down to a suitable level. There is such a difference between those 2 sentences. They mean the same thing. They're getting at the same idea, but how they express it is totally different. It is changing the word order. It is changing the kind of examples it gives. So using this legitimate paraphrasing, changing the sentence structure, but still expressing the same idea is extremely important for when you're writing your papers. And that is it. That is everything we have to say about structuring strong papers. I've got on the screen here again some information on how to book appointments, because again, we can talk about anything that was brought up in today's video, anything that was brought up in the orientation videos. We're probably going to be having a short Q&A time in your class as well, where you can ask some more specific questions. But if you want a little bit more time on your own, one-on-one with one of our consultants, you can do so. You can book online and we will be happy to work with you. But that's all I have for today. Enjoy the rest of your day and can't wait to work with you soon. All the best.